Congratulations, you have finished physical chemistry. And now to a new topic, 也就是我们的 inorganic chemistry. if you do not, 如果你有看到我 assign 的那个 booklet 的话，我们其实有分为多两种 chemistry. I mean, in the future there are small, but for A level, we'll be looking at inorganic and also organic too. So let's have a look. So 如果你有看过我之前的那个 video，或者是甚至在我们的 workshop 里面，我们是可以就是 cover 到 atomic radius itself is increasing to the left side and also downward. Okay, this is for atomic radius. So that's something for us to remember lah. So in the exam, we know that as soon as we see atomic radius, it would just be like, okay, to the left side and down. And also a brief recap, 就是我们的 atomic radius is actually the radius that is between 我们的 let's have a look, the distance from the nucleus to the outer electron shell. Okay, so 我们在这里呢，我们就会看到 as the period increase 的时候，我们的 number of proton will also increase. So that means 我们的 electrons increases as well. 可是因为它们 start to fill up already，所以我们就开始 form more orbits. Okay, 就是我们如果是 talk in terms of GCSE 的话 is in terms of orbits. We are starting to have more orbits, but it should be orbital. Our whole apologies charges should like increase the attraction. So that's the reason why outer shell is pulled closer and closer. Okay, so don't just think it in terms of size. It's actually more electron and more protons will result into more attraction. So it happens kind of like condensed together. Okay, so that's the reason why the atomic radius decreases. But one thing we haven't been introduced to the ionic radius. 在我们的 ionic radius that is usually formed when we have losing electron or like gaining electron because it's ionic, right? Okay, so but in this case we will talk about losing electron first. So 我们在这里呢 it's actually forming of positive ion. Okay, so let's have a look what happens. So first thing I want to talk about 是我们的 positive ions. So 我们在这里有三个 positive ions, sodium plus, magnesium 2 plus, and aluminum 3 plus. 这三个都是所谓的 isoelectronics. What you realize is 它们全部都是有一样的 electron configuration, but they all have different protons. 之前来讲，我们确实一个 proton 就会 attract，if I mean not necessarily the truth， 可是我们去想一想啦 ，OK， 就是我们的之前的时候，如果不是 ion 的情况下，是ratio 是 one electron to one proton。But right now 是两个 proton 或者是三个 proton 去 attract one electron. So that results into greater reaction of not greater reaction, greater attraction. So that results into 我们的 radius of the ion decreases. So 如果我们 lose the electron 后面的时候更多，我们的那一个 ionic radius will also decrease because the stronger attraction. So same goes to our negative ions. Okay, so 我们的 negative ions 的时候，如果我们的因为我们的 increasing of the numbers, okay, will pull closer of the outer shell. So that also decreases 我们的 ionic radius. Okay, so basically 如果我们的 ratio it's not like balance, it's usually decreasing the rate 那一个 ionic radius. Okay, so basically if it's not 1 to 1, anything that's 1 to 1, 我们的 ionic radius will start to decrease. But one thing is 我们要看一下这一个 silicon 这里，就 want to make note is that the silicon itself 它是突然间 jump 的。Okay, why is it a jump? I would say 就是讲关于到它的那个，它 is a mix，就你会发现到这一个本身啊，silicon 啊，它 it can be both ionic and negative and positive ionic， so 它 this can make a difference. Okay, so that's the reason why it got a heap of jump over there. But you remember one thing， 在 ionic radius 我们其实在 data booklet 或者 data booklet 里面，我们是可以有看到 information 的。So in case you forgot, you can actually refer to data booklet. Okay, but anyways, in terms of logic, it's actually 我们的 atomic radius increases the number of proton. 在我们的 atomic radius 里面 number of proton increases， 所以就 resulting to more attractions to pull the electrons together. Okay, so 我们现在来看关于的 in terms of melting point。那如果你只是学过关于 physical chemistry and you probably have heard of melting point will only increase across the period. This is such a misconception. Okay, in fact, 我们如果学会了关于到 different type of bonding 的时候，那一个才是真正我们可以知道的。But we will look detailedly what are the data. Okay, so it is true that it's increasing from here to here. Okay, sodium, magnesium to aluminium, 甚至到 silicon 这里。But 我会画 different arrow. Reason being 是因为这里三个是我们的 strength of metallic bonding. Okay, they all increase. Okay, and because it's due to 我们的那个 free electrons. And 如果是我们 silicon 是因为 because 它的那个 giant molecular structure, but it have sudden decrease with this four. Except for argon, I should draw another arrow 因为它是 different property, 它是一个 gas. 在我们的 phosphorus, sulfur 还有 chloride 的时候是 simple molecular structure, so it's only weak when the walls forces. Okay, so that's the reason why it's a low melting point. Well, speaking of which, there's the data. Okay, so 我们看到这里的情况是，这里是一个 graph in terms of sodium 还有我们的那个就是每一个 period tree， 然后每一个 melting point 还有 boiling point。What you notice 就像我讲的一样，是在我们的 sodium, magnesium, aluminium 全部都是 increasing trend。OK, except for magnesium 还有 aluminium， 它们可能是有一点点的不一样而已，看起来没有什么差别，可是它其实是一点点的不一样 ，but it's still increasing. OK， 可是当我们 phosphorus 的时候，我们就不一样了。OK， so just have to keep note of that. Also, it's different for boiling point. Boiling point 的话，它其实就是在我们的这一个部分是 the highest， 也就是我们的 aluminium is the highest， 然后 silicon 开始下降。Okay. Now, what we want to know is actually 它的 electrical conductivity. So electrical conductivity increases from sodium to aluminium， 因为全部都是 magnesium 那个什么嘛，对不对 ？Free of electrons. So more of free electrons, so resulting to more of the flow. Now, silicon is a semiconductor. Okay, so 它是一般的。Okay, it's 如果你要自己去 research 也是 it's okay, but definitely not in A level. It's not learnable in A level. 所以 if you are interested, feel free to do some research with the semiconductor for silicon. And the last one, 因为我们的 phosphorus, sulfur 还有 chloride, 它们全部都是 simple molecular structure, so no free electrons, so hence they do not conduct. So what we are actually synthesizing 是我们的 bonding with melting point and conductivity. Okay, so that's the reason why 为什么我一开始就要 introduce bonding 的那一个 topic in physical chemistry, and that's the reason why it's so important. Okay, so for this case 就是做这里的 past paper question, and you're good to go. So right now 我们就可以讲关于到它们 period tree 的 reaction. So we're looking at oxygen, we'll be looking at chloride, and also water's reaction, or maybe more. So 在我们的 period tree 里面呢，OK，it's usually 我们会把它reacting with the 那个 oxygen。OK，so for example 我们有oxygen 本身它是 mixed with sodium gaseous, magnesium, aluminium aluminium，还有我们的 phosphorus，but of course depends on the balancing of the equation，还有我们的那个 configuration 啦。OK，but of course at the same time 我们也是会 mix 很 popular 的就是 mix with chloride。OK，so just keep in mind 就是 period tree 它是永远 a lot of the cases 是 oxygen 还有我们的 chloride 的。But 我们其实在 period tree 里面呢，我们只能是 mix with，只有 sodium 还有 magnesium 是可以 mix with water 的。So what that means is that these are the things 你需要去 remember. Okay, so just take note that period tree is common in reacting with oxygen, chloride, and sodium and magnesium with water. So 如果我们开始记得了我们关于到 oxidation number, so a little bit of recap， 我们会用到的是 1, 2, 3 FHOCl. Okay, so in this case， 你试下去写这个 oxidation number in your book. And what you realize is phosphorus 还有 sulfur 这两个东西，它们是 always at the highest oxidation state, but it's not always achieved. Okay, so this is quite interesting. It's one of the interesting fact, and it's actually occurring 在我们的 period tree 里面的。So period tree is like one of the, I would say the only period that's more interesting 啦，因为它 they can have a lot of things happening at the same time. Okay, but just take a note of it， 因为这个也是很重要，在我们的exam 的时候，我们会用到很多关于到这些 information 的。OK， so 其实我们也是要看过这些东西了啦，就是关于到我们的 oxides 啊这些东西 ，correct？ So 尤其是我们的这个 reaction， 如果我们要 mix with oxide 还有 water 的话是可以的。Okay, so we have N2O, that's ionic, MgO, that's ionic, Al2O3, that's ionic too. But 在我们这里的情况 silicon oxide, P4O10 sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide， 它们全部都是 covalent compound。我们怎样去 explain? It's because we use electronegativity. But the one thing regarding of this oxides 在 period tree 的 oxides 里面，它其实只能是有 sodium oxide 还有我们的 magnesium oxide to mix with water. So this case they mix with water that results into hydroxide. So you have to keep in mind in terms of oxide, in terms of period tree, 只有 sodium 还有 magnesium always have or can react with water. So in terms of acid and bases， 其实我们会看到的一个东西是关于到这个 sodium 的，就是我们也是关于到这个 periodic tree 的。OK， 我们从左边去右边看的话，we are actually forming from the most basic oxide 去 most acidic one. The way that I remember 这一个是我直接看 periodic table， 因为我们为什么呢？我直接看到的是 sodium, magnesium, aluminium, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur. But one thing is that 我们要记得 sulfur happens twice. Okay, another thing is 我们的这一个 aluminium 和我们的 sodium they are in 2, phosphorus is in 4. So 这一个是我们要去记得的 in terms of the oxide. Now, one thing is that 我们有一个叫做 amphoteric oxide. You might think that it's this P4, but interestingly, it is aluminium 2O3. Okay, 这一个是可以 mix with 我们的 acid and bases 的 both of them. Okay, so that's one thing to remember. But we will look detailedly in there. So 其实为什么是这个样子呢？ We can actually do some testing. Okay, so 因为我们知道左边的那些都是 acidic bases 嘛，对不对？所以我们就要用 acids 来去 balance it. Okay, so we can see that the sodium and magnesium 我们用的是 acid to balance, and same vice versa. 因为它们是 acid 的关系，我们要用 bases 来去 mix it. But for amphoteric reaction, amphoteric oxide, 它们是两个都可以的。Okay, so this is actually quite interesting. Okay, because the reason being is because 它其实是差不多在中间的。Okay, 所以我去哪一边我都是可以去做的。But one thing is that remember, okay, one key thing about this one, 就是在我们的 mixing with bases for this one is actually not H2O. 因为我们 also require water in there. So this is kind of like the one that's exemption lah. Okay, so you have to be really careful about 这一个的那个 bases mixed with bases. Okay, so make sure to keep in mind of that. So right now 我们要看的是关于到 chlorides 的部分。而 chlorides 的部分，我们会看到一个东西是我们的 sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, aluminum chloride，这个是我们刚刚看到的啦。Okay, so if that's the case， 我们其实会发现到的就是 sodium chloride， 它是 dissolved in water mixed to a 7. Okay, so magnesium chloride is dissolved in water， 我们的 pH 是 6.5. Okay, getting more acidic, but aluminum chloride will also produce some 我们的 HCl gas. This is interesting. Okay, 所以也就是讲说它们是开始 decompose 的。Okay, decompose, not displacement happens, so that resulted into some hydraulic chloride gas. And the last one, 如果是 non-metal 的 chloride 的情况下 it's also strongly exothermic reaction. 也就是讲是它们会 form something that's like steam, like that. Okay, so for non-metal, it's always like that. So these are the things you have to remember for the exam. I would say 这一个东西应该要用到experiment 的东西才可以真实的去记得啦。Otherwise 我看一下到时候会不会可以 embed 到一些 video 给你们去看。So in a way 我们的那个 chloride 还有 waters 的那一个部分也是一样的。So as electronegativity 就是 increases across the periodic table 嘛，对不对？我们也是知道这一个的。那 aluminium 它是不会跟 chloride make into the bond， 然后也就是讲它们是有 covalent 的 bonding 啦，或者是 covalent character。所以 when it starts to form， 我们其实会 steam up make into a exist as a dimer. Okay, 你看到吗？就是我们原本应该是要这样子的嘛，对不对？ But actually they can form into aluminium 2 and chloride 6, which is resulting into same scenario here. Okay, 这是很多 cases 我们也是可以这个样子去看的。那 with this case, okay, so for example 看到吗？我们but anyways, the main part is that we always have the steamy fumes that is actually made up of hydrochloric acid. I mean, not really the 那不是那一个什么啦，不是那个 liquid or not the aqueous， 它其实是一个 steamy fume 来的。Okay. So that's pretty much the end of periodic table, the inorganic chemistry. What I would like you to do is using your notes and find the element which you think the elements actually in period 3 has an oxide and with a giant structure that will at the same time neutralize or form into covalent bonds with chloride. Put it into the discussion board. And the last but not least, for this part, 我们是有 past paper question. Have a go at this. And the last one, which is about our end of unit. So well done. On the next one, we'll be looking at specific groups. And if I recall correctly, it's going to be group 2 for the next one. Okay, so right.